For decades, hundreds of perfectly preserved mummies lay buried beneath the scorching sands of China's Tarim Basin, their faces frozen in time, their origins shrouded in mystery. Scientists believed they knew who these people were, until DNA analysis revealed a truth so shocking it rewrote everything we thought we knew about ancient Asian history. Imagine standing in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Tarim Basin, located in the Xinjiang region of northwestern China, is a place where temperatures soar during the day and plummet at night. It's a vast expanse of desert, sand dunes, and salt flats that stretches across thousands of kilometers. This is a place where survival is nearly impossible for most living creatures. Yet, buried beneath this unforgiving landscape, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a sophisticated civilization that thrived here thousands of years ago. The story of these ancient people, preserved in an extraordinary way by the very desert that surrounds them, is one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries of our time. The discovery of these mummies began gradually in the 1990s, when excavations started revealing something remarkable. Archaeologists were not expecting to find what they found. What emerged from the earth were hundreds of remarkably well-preserved human remains. These were not ordinary skeletal remains. These were mummies, naturally preserved by the arid climate of the desert. Their skin was still intact. Their hair remained on their heads. Their clothing was still wearable. Some even had fingernails and eyelashes perfectly preserved after thousands of years. The most famous cemetery among these discoveries is Xiaohe, which was excavated between 2002 and 2005. When archaeologists opened these ancient graves, they encountered something that seemed completely out of place in the heart of Asia. The bodies were buried in boats, not actual boats used for sailing, but wooden coffins shaped like boats. This burial practice was entirely unique to this region, and unlike anything archaeologists had seen before in East Asia. The coffins were crafted with meticulous care, demonstrating remarkable woodworking skills and an attention to detail that speaks to cultural values and beliefs about the afterlife. Each coffin was individually made, some larger than others, suggesting they were customized for the individuals they contained. The wooden construction itself is remarkable, given the scarcity of trees in the desert region. The wood had to be sourced from distant forests and transported across vast distances, indicating trade networks and resource management systems of considerable sophistication. Alongside the mummified remains, they discovered extraordinary grave goods that painted a picture of a people with sophisticated culture and international connections. The sheer variety and quantity of objects buried with these people was astonishing to the archaeologists who excavated them. These grave goods included finely woven woolen garments that showed exceptional craftsmanship. There was pottery with distinctive designs. There were tools made from bone and stone, indicating advanced knowledge of working with materials. But perhaps most intriguingly, they found preserved food items. These included cheese, wheat, and millet. These weren't random food scraps. The presence of these specific items in the graves suggested something profound about who these people were and where they came from. The cheese, in particular, was a crucial clue. Cheese production requires knowledge of dairy farming and fermentation techniques. It requires contact with animals and an understanding of food preservation methods. Looking at these mummies in detail, archaeologists noticed something striking. Many of them had features that appeared distinctly Western. They had light-colored hair, lighter skin tones, and facial structures that seemed more European than Asian. Some had reddish or blonde hair, which is extremely rare in East Asian populations. These physical characteristics, combined with the woolen clothing and the presence of cheese, led archaeologists to a seemingly obvious conclusion. These people must have been migrants from the West. They must have been herders from the steppes of Central Asia, or perhaps farmers from the mountainous regions along the Silk Road. They must have brought Western culture, Western technology, and Western genes into this remote corner of China. This hypothesis made sense to researchers. After all, the Tarim Basin was geographically positioned on what would eventually become the Silk Road, that famous network of trade routes connecting East and West. The region had always been a crossroads where different peoples and cultures met. The idea that Western peoples had migrated eastward and settled in the Tarim Basin seemed perfectly reasonable. Scholars proposed that these mummies were Proto-Tocharian-speaking pastoralists, connected to the Afanasyevo culture of southern Siberia. The Afanasyevo were known herders who lived thousands of years ago and had genetic connections to the Yamnaya people of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, far to the west. This narrative seemed solid. It explained the Western appearance of the mummies. It explained the cultural artifacts. It explained the international trade goods. It seemed to solve the mystery of who these people were and how they came to live in the Tarim Basin. But in 2021, when scientists finally conducted comprehensive DNA analysis on 13 of these mummies, everything changed. The results were so unexpected that researchers initially questioned their own findings. They rechecked their work multiple times. They consulted with colleagues. They expanded their analysis. What they discovered was not what anyone had predicted. The DNA told a completely different story. The mummies were not migrants from the West. They were not invaders or colonizers who brought foreign genes into this region. Instead, the DNA revealed something far more mysterious and far more profound. These people were descendants of an ancient population known as the ancient North Eurasians, a genetic group that had been widespread during the Ice Age but had largely disappeared from the Earth by the end of that period, approximately 10,000 years ago. How could this be? How could people carry genetic material from a population that had supposedly vanished 10,000 years before they were even born? This discovery raised profound questions about human history. The ancient North Eurasians were hunter-gatherers who lived during the Ice Age, when much of the northern hemisphere was covered in ice and snow. They were adapted to harsh, cold climates. They hunted megafauna and gathered plants in tundra-like environments. By all accounts, their populations had dwindled as the climate warmed and the ice retreated. In modern times, traces of ancient North Eurasian DNA are found primarily among indigenous populations in Siberia and the Americas, remnants of their vast ancient range. Some researchers have traced this genetic lineage through various populations and migrations, following the genetic thread through thousands of years of human history. The patterns of distribution suggest that ancient North Eurasians once ranged across an enormous territory, from Western Europe to Eastern Siberia, adapting to the diverse environments they encountered. Their descendants spread across the frozen north and eventually crossed into the Americas during the last ice age. Yet here, in the Tarim Basin, in the year 2021, scientists were finding people who carried this ancient genetic signature in nearly pure form, thousands of years after this population was believed to have disappeared from the historical and archaeological record. The analysis went deeper. Researchers compared the DNA of the 13 Tarim Basin mummies with one another. What they found was astonishing. Individuals who were separated by 400 kilometers, living on opposite ends of the Tarim Basin, had DNA that was as similar as siblings. This level of genetic similarity was extraordinary. It suggested that these people were extraordinarily isolated genetically. They were not intermarrying with surrounding populations. They were not mixing with the migrant herders who were settling in nearby regions. They maintained their genetic distinctiveness despite living in a region that was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan. Yet this genetic isolation existed alongside cultural openness. This is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the story. While the Tarim Basin mummies remained genetically pure, descended from ancient North Eurasians with no admixture from Western or Eastern populations, they were not culturally isolated. By 4,000 years ago, these people had adopted technologies and practices that came from outside their immediate region. They wore woolen clothing made from the wool of domesticated sheep and goats. Wool is not naturally available in the Tarim Basin. The sheep and goats they herded were domesticated animals that originated elsewhere, requiring knowledge of animal husbandry, selective breeding, and herd management. They grew wheat and millet, crops that were not native to their region but came from other parts of Eurasia. Wheat originated in the Fertile Crescent and represents one of the most important domesticated crops in human history. Millet came from Eastern Asia and represents another crucial agricultural development. They built irrigation systems to manage water in this arid environment, demonstrating engineering knowledge that they must have acquired through contact with other peoples. These irrigation systems were not simple ditches. They were sophisticated engineering projects designed to distribute scarce water efficiently across cultivable land, allowing agriculture to flourish in a region where it otherwise would have been impossible. The cheese they consumed represents perhaps the most telling piece of evidence about their cultural openness. Making cheese requires knowledge of dairy production. It requires understanding how milk transforms through fermentation. It requires specific equipment and techniques. This knowledge did not originate with the Tarim Basin people. They must have learned it through contact with other groups, specifically the Afanasyevo herders who lived in the neighboring Dzungarian Basin. Researchers found milk proteins preserved in the dental tartar of 7 Tarim Basin mummies, indicating that these individuals regularly consumed dairy products. This practice suggests cultural transmission across geographic boundaries, an exchange of knowledge and practices between populations. This creates a remarkable picture of ancient Tarim Basin society. Here was a people, genetically descended from Ice Age hunter-gatherers, living in isolation and maintaining their genetic identity for thousands of years. Yet they were not closed off from the world around them. They were innovative and adaptive. They recognized the value of technologies and practices developed by other peoples and incorporated them into their own culture. They adopted herding practices. They learned to cultivate new crops. They mastered the production of cheese. They wove wool into clothing with sophisticated designs. They were, in every meaningful way, engaged with the wider world, even as they maintained their genetic distinctiveness. The research team that made this discovery was international in scope, reflecting the global nature of modern scientific inquiry. Led by archaeogeneticist Yingqiu Kui of Jilin University in Changchun in China, the team included researchers from institutions across China, Europe, and the United States, bringing diverse perspectives and expertise to the analysis. Their work was published in the prestigious journal Nature in October 2021, making an immediate impact on the field of ancient DNA research and archaeology worldwide. The study examined genomic data from 13 individuals from the Tarim Basin dating to approximately 2100 to 1700 BCE, during what archaeologists call the early to middle Bronze Age. They also analyzed 5 individuals from the neighboring Dzungarian Basin, dating to approximately 3000 to 2800 BCE. The time gap between these two groups provided crucial information about population changes over several centuries, allowing researchers to track how populations in the region evolved and transformed during the early Bronze Age. The differences between the two groups proved illuminating. The Dzungarian Basin individuals showed predominantly Afanasyevo ancestry with an additional local contribution. This indicates that the Dzungarian Basin saw genuine genetic mixing, with migrant herders from the west intermarrying with local populations. The pattern was different in the Tarim Basin. The Tarim Basin mummies showed exclusively local ancestry. They maintained their genetic lineage without mixing with incoming populations. This pattern persisted even during the early Bronze Age, a period when movement and migration were increasing across Central Asia. To understand the significance of this finding, it helps to consider the broader context of Bronze Age Asia. The period, around 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, was one of increasing complexity and movement. Pastoralist groups were expanding their ranges. Trade networks were developing. Agricultural societies were consolidating. Technologies were spreading across vast distances. In this context, most populations experienced genetic mixing. Groups that lived near each other interbred. Invaders and migrants brought new genetic material to established populations. Change was constant and genetic mixing was widespread. The Tarim Basin mummies, maintaining pure genetic ancestry while adopting foreign cultural practices, were exceptions to this pattern. The Xiaohe culture, as archaeologists have named the civilization of these mummies, represents something genuinely unique in the archaeological record. They mixed animal herding with plant cultivation. They were not purely pastoral, nor were they purely agricultural. They maintained a balanced subsistence strategy that drew on multiple food sources. Their boat-shaped coffins, unlike any others in the region, suggest a burial practice that had deep cultural significance. Perhaps the boats represented a journey to the afterlife, or a connection to water in a land where water was precious. The specific design and construction of these coffins, refined over generations, speaks to a culture with deep traditions and consistent practices. The artifacts buried with these people tell additional stories. Some individuals were buried with elaborate headdresses. Others were buried with what appeared to be hunting weapons or tools of their trade. A woman was found with a mirror made of bronze, suggesting status and wealth. Some bodies were buried with multiple sets of clothing, indicating access to resources and time for craftsmanship. The careful arrangement of objects in the graves suggests a belief system that valued the afterlife and a willingness to expend significant resources to ensure the proper provisioning of the dead. These were people with complex social organization, with status differentiation, and with spiritual beliefs that guided their practice. The diversity of maternal lineages found in the Xiaohe cemetery provides another layer of complexity. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from the mother, revealed that the Xiaohe people carried a wide variety of maternal lineages. They possessed West Eurasian lineages, including H, K, U5, U7, U2E, and T. They carried East Eurasian lineages, including B, C4, C5, D, and G2A. They even possessed Indian lineages, such as M5. This diversity is remarkable. It suggests that women from many different geographic origins had been incorporated into Tarim Basin society. This could have occurred through marriage exchanges, through the adoption of women from other groups, or through other forms of cultural contact. Yet despite this diversity of maternal lineages, the overall genetic profile remained ancient North Eurasian. This pattern suggests a specific scenario. Perhaps men of ancient North Eurasian ancestry remained in the Tarim Basin, maintaining their population core. Women from various external groups were incorporated into the society through marriage or other means. Over generations, this pattern would gradually shift the maternal lineage composition while maintaining the overall nuclear DNA profile, particularly if the male lineages were dominant or if certain cultural practices favored the inheritance of male line genetics. Alternatively, the diverse maternal lineages might represent admixture that occurred at an earlier period, before the population consolidated into the genetically isolated group observed by the time of the Xiaohe cemetery. The practical skills these people possessed speak to a sophisticated understanding of their environment and of resource management. Building and maintaining irrigation systems in a desert environment requires significant engineering knowledge. It requires understanding water flow, soil composition, and evaporation rates. It requires coordinating labor and maintaining structures over time. Growing wheat and millet in the Tarim Basin would have required careful selection of locations, management of water resources, and timing of planting and harvest. These were not simple agricultural pursuits. They represent the adaptation of already developed agricultural knowledge to a new and challenging environment. The herding of sheep, goats, and cattle in the Tarim Basin similarly required expertise. These domesticated animals needed consistent access to water and grazing land. Management of herds requires knowledge of breeding, disease prevention, and seasonal movement patterns. The ability to produce cheese and other dairy products requires knowledge of fermentation and food preservation. When we consider all of these skills and practices together, a picture emerges of a people who were highly adaptable and eager to learn. They encountered new technologies and practices and recognized their value. They had the organizational capacity and the labor resources to implement these new practices successfully. The discovery of the Tarim Basin mummies and their genetic analysis has profound implications for our understanding of ancient history. It challenges the idea that genetic similarity equals cultural similarity. It demonstrates that populations can maintain genetic distinctiveness while embracing cultural change. It suggests that the movements and migrations of Bronze Age peoples were more complex than simple invasion and settlement narratives. It reveals the agency of local populations in selecting and adopting cultural practices that served their needs and interests. It shows that ancient peoples were not passive recipients of technological change, but active participants in cultural exchange and innovation. The timeline of these events is also significant. The Tarim Basin mummies lived during the early to Middle Bronze Age, a period when bronze technology was spreading across Eurasia. They lived during a time when the first formal empires were consolidating in Egypt and Mesopotamia. They lived during the age of the earliest Chinese dynasties. Yet, in their remote corner of the world, they maintained a way of life rooted in their own traditions, while selectively adopting technologies and practices that enhanced their survival and prosperity. They represent an alternative pathway to civilization, one that was not oriented toward empire or conquest, but toward adaptation and cultural synthesis. The natural mummification process that preserved these people so perfectly was itself a form of luck and circumstance. The extreme aridity of the Tarim Basin creates conditions hostile to decay. Bacteria that normally decompose organic matter cannot survive in such dry conditions. Fungi and other decomposers cannot thrive. The result is that bodies buried in this environment undergo natural mummification. The skin dries and tightens around the bones. Internal organs are preserved in a desiccated state. Hair and nails remain intact. Textiles do not rot. Even the colors of clothing and grave goods remain vivid. This natural preservation has given us an extraordinarily detailed view of Bronze Age life in Central Asia. Scientists have been able to extract detailed information from these mummies beyond what DNA analysis alone could reveal. Stable isotope analysis of bones and teeth provides information about diet, showing what foods these people consumed and where those foods came from. Analysis of pollen grains trapped in the desiccated intestines can reveal what plants were being eaten at the time of death. Examination of pathological conditions on bones provides information about disease and injury. Microscopic analysis of textiles reveals weaving techniques and the types of fibers used. These multiple lines of evidence converge to create a rich picture of how these people lived, what they ate, what clothes they wore, and what health challenges they faced. The genetic analysis itself represents a remarkable achievement of modern science. Extracting DNA from mummified remains that are 4,000 years old is technically challenging. The DNA is fragmented into tiny pieces. It is contaminated with environmental DNA from fungi and bacteria that colonize the remains after death. It is damaged by the passage of time and the chemical processes of decomposition and desiccation. Yet modern sequencing technologies can reconstruct enough of the original genome to make meaningful comparisons with other ancient and modern populations. The ability to sequence 13 individual genomes and compare them across such a large geographic area represents the culmination of decades of methodological development in the field of ancient DNA research. The implications of this research extend beyond the Tarim Basin itself. Understanding the population history of Central Asia is crucial for understanding how modern populations came to be distributed as they are. The Tarim Basin mummies represent a population that has no clear living descendants. The ancient North Eurasian genetic signature they carried persists today only in very small amounts in indigenous populations of Siberia and the Americas. Whatever happened to the genetically pure Tarim Basin populations between the Bronze Age and the present, they were eventually replaced or absorbed by other groups. By historical times, the Tarim Basin was inhabited by Turkic-speaking peoples with entirely different genetic backgrounds. The story of this transition from the Bronze Age Tarim Basin mummies to historical Turks and other Eurasian peoples represents a vast chapter of human history that is still not fully understood. This replacement pattern was likely driven by the processes of cultural and demographic change that characterized the later Bronze Age and Iron Age in Central Asia. Pastoral populations from the steppes gradually expanded their ranges. Trade networks intensified and became more formalized. Political consolidation created larger and more powerful states. These large-scale historical processes eventually reached the Tarim Basin and transformed it. The genetic isolation that characterized the Bronze Age mummies was eventually broken. New populations entered the region. Mixing occurred. Gradually, the pure ancient North Eurasian genetic signature of the Xiaohe culture faded from the population. Yet the legacy of the Xiaohe culture and other Bronze Age Tarim Basin peoples likely persisted in ways that left no genetic trace. Cultural practices, religious beliefs, stories, and knowledge systems can persist even when the genetic composition of a population changes. Archaeological evidence suggests that later historical populations in the Tarim Basin maintained some continuities with Bronze Age practices. Agricultural techniques may have persisted. Irrigation systems built by ancient peoples may have continued to be used and maintained. Religious sites may have retained significance across cultural transitions. Thus, while genetic continuity was broken, cultural continuity may have persisted to some degree. The study of the Tarim Basin mummies also has implications for understanding the origins of early Chinese civilization. The Tarim Basin was geographically separate from the Yellow River Valley, where the earliest Chinese states developed. Yet the populations of these two regions were not entirely isolated. Trade goods, technologies, and ideas moved between them. The peopling of the Tarim Basin and the development of civilization, they were part of the same broad historical processes that saw the emergence of civilization across Eurasia during the Bronze Age. Understanding the Tarim Basin helps us understand China and Central Asia as interconnected regions shaped by ongoing movement, exchange, and interaction. The story of the Tarim Basin mummies also speaks to the complex nature of identity in the ancient world. Modern people tend to think of identity in terms of genetics, ethnicity, language, and culture as unified and coherent packages. We assume that people who speak the same language share the same genes, have the same culture, and think of themselves as part of the same group. The Tarim Basin mummies demonstrate that this is not always the case. A people can maintain genetic identity while adopting foreign cultural practices and technologies. They can share cultural practices with neighboring peoples while maintaining genetic distinctiveness and isolation. Identity is complex and multifaceted in ways that modern analytical categories often fail to capture. The categories we use to understand human populations today may not have been relevant to people in the distant past. Perhaps these ancient peoples thought of themselves in terms of kinship networks, shared religious practices, or common residence rather than in terms of ethnic or genetic categories that would only become meaningful thousands of years later. The preservation of these mummies and their study by modern science represents a remarkable convergence of circumstance and human curiosity. The extreme climate of the Tarim Basin preserved bodies that would have decayed to dust in most environments. Archaeological expeditions, conducted over decades, uncovered these remains systematically. Advances in genetic technology made it possible to extract and analyze ancient DNA. International scientific collaboration brought together researchers with different expertise and perspectives. A commitment to rigorous methodology ensured that the findings could withstand scrutiny and revision. The result is knowledge that would have been impossible to obtain even 50 years ago, and that will continue to generate new insights as research methods advance further. The Tarim Basin mummies have captured public imagination because their story challenges our assumptions and expands our understanding of human history. We tend to think of the ancient world as simpler than our modern world, with populations more isolated and unchanging. Yet the Tarim Basin mummies demonstrate that ancient peoples were sophisticated, adaptable, and engaged in cross-cultural exchange. They show that technological innovation and cultural borrowing have been features of human society for thousands of years. They demonstrate that movement and migration are not modern phenomena, but ancient ones. They reveal that human identity is complex and that genetic ancestry does not determine cultural affiliation or social organization. Complete pictures of Bronze Age population movements will emerge. As new archaeological discoveries are made, physical remains of these ancient peoples will continue to provide information about how they lived. The story of the Tarim Basin mummies is not complete. It is a story that science is still actively investigating and that will likely continue to surprise us for decades to come. The central mystery remains fascinating. How did a population so genetically distinct, descended from Ice Age hunter-gatherers, come to live in the heart of Central Asia in the Bronze Age? How did they maintain such genetic purity while embracing cultural practices from elsewhere? What belief systems and worldviews guided their choices? What languages did they speak? How did they understand their own place in the world? These questions cannot be answered by genetics and archaeology alone. They require imagination and empathy, an attempt to understand the inner lives of ancient people based on the material evidence they left behind. The mummies cannot speak to us directly, but the objects buried with them, their bones and teeth and preserved tissues, their textiles and tools and food remains, all tell stories that patient researchers are still learning to read. The discovery of the Tarim Basin mummies and the genetic analysis that revealed their true origins represents one of the most significant archaeological and genetic findings of recent decades. It has forced scholars to reconsider long-held assumptions about Bronze Age population movements and cultural development. It has demonstrated the power of ancient DNA analysis to overturn hypotheses based on physical appearance and cultural artifacts alone. It has shown that the ancient world was far more complex and cosmopolitan than we might have imagined. And it has added another fascinating chapter to the long story of human migration, cultural exchange, and adaptation that is the history of our species. As science continues to advance and new evidence continues to emerge, the story of these remarkable people preserved in the sands of the Tarim Basin will undoubtedly reveal even more surprising truths about our shared human past.